how long, you're assessing the situation, how long do you think it might take for this continental free trade area to be born, bearing in mind it took Europe half a century and still it's not quite the trading area that they hoped for. There's a lot of paperwork to be done. Some of the reports I'm reading saying maybe decades, but what do you think?
I think, it's a journey. And it took 13 months, for the agreement to be signed up by 54 countries. They've crossed the 22 country mark for ratification, and July 2020 is the effective take-off date. So it's a journey, and you would find that different countries are at different states of readiness in terms of making sure that they begin to phase out their tariffs. They improve ability to get visas. In East Africa, for instance, you don't need visas to move around as well as in West and SADC. So it's going to be a race. Those who prepare early, I believe, would be the winners. And it's a journey that we would continue to track. And I'm hopeful that the AU would have clear metrics by which they can track progress and, more importantly, hold themselves accountable to.
Albert, I mean, one of the promises of this free trade area is free movement of goods and skills and services. Laudable, surely, but isn't there a problem sometimes with these trading blocks that the best people can be sucked into the biggest economies with the most money? Isn't that a danger for the continent as a whole?
Chris, my sense is, free movement of skills comes with free movement of people. So the first thing, or the next agenda from my perspective for the AU, is to implement this, African passport they've been talking about. I think that's the first step if we are really serious in implementing this agenda, because, as we move to the digital economy, as we move to to implementing this agreement, we cannot think of an economy based in services that does not allow free movement of people. I think this is the most important, point. Now, will that lead to people moving and concentrating to different countries? Very likely. But if we are thinking Africa instead of thinking countries, which is the principle under which we have embarked on this journey, then this shouldn't be such a worry. The worry would be, are we as Africa claiming a bigger share of world trade, yes or no? Are we as African actually trading more within the continent? Are we actually creating the kind of value chains within the continents that will generate the millions and millions of jobs needed by our youth and our women, our girls? I think these are the questions.
I mean, Shola, if I can come back to you quickly, a lot of people I've been talking to here at the World Economic Forum say this isn't the time for nationalism, this isn't the time for economic nationalism. It's laudable. To me, that's the hope of the world, but I don't know. How likely is it, you think, that there can be this joint political will to see through this very important move in the economics of this continent?
Right.
Well, we've seen the political will to actually get the agreement ratified. I think what we need to see more on the continent is better economic governance. And I'm hoping that, as the governments come together, as they understand the implications of bringing down barriers, driving intra-Africa trade, that our ability to improve economic governance, to strengthen our institutions, we will have the political will to put that in place.
And Mr. Kanyako, so there's a lot of paperwork to be done yet, putting things in place, measures in place. What do you think is going to be the greatest challenge, you think, for this continental free trade area?
I'm yet to think of challenges. I would like to think of the opportunities it offers, and as we take advantage of the opportunities, we will figure out what the challenges are. The one thing that we need to bring to the fore is that there is a lot of talk of countries trading with each other. And that is the problem that you would have with the balance on the panel. But it's private companies that are trading with each other. They just happen to be coming from particular countries. And so coming to grips with what the challenges are going to be means that there has got to be a conversation that involves African companies that are doing trade with other companies on the African continent to say to them, tell us, what are the barriers that you are facing and what is it that you would like cleared? That is one thing. The second thing is that there is a lot that we are going to have to deal with here. African Continental Trade Agreement. How do we deal with trade? As I said, the continent must trade with the rest of the world. There are going to be people with not such cool intentions who would want to take advantage of these things. So setting down the ground rules is going to be the next important thing to look at. And the point, though, is that the people who set the rules are the ones who are elected by the public, not the kind of panel that you have here.
But Shola, again, from the finance side of it, one of the big gaps that need to be filled is this transport infrastructure. Too many countries in the past, they had a railway to the port, and that was it. We now need infrastructure across all African countries. Private-public partnerships are being seen as the way out. How do you see it?
Absolutely. I mean, SDG 17 is partnerships to achieve the goals. And the reality is that the public sector does not have sufficient capital to deliver the infrastructure that is required on the continent. We know where debt levels are. That therefore means that there has to be collaboration with commercial banks, with DFIs, with export credit agencies, with philanthropic organizations, with venture capitalists, equity providers. And the only way you can get all these stakeholders working together is when you have a clear regulatory and legal framework. You must have governance that is transparent. One of the best examples I like to refer to is the South African, the Renewable Independent Power Procurement process, the office, whereby they publicly stated their renewable plan over the next 5 to 10 years. There was transparency in terms of the licensing bids. And therefore, the private sector had the confidence to invest in renewable energy. About $14 billion has come in through that program. And that's a model that can be replicated. So clear rules, a governance structure, and bringing all the different parties together is how we will be able to attract the much needed capital. And the point about having conversations, private sector, public sector, is so critical because the concerns of each of the stakeholders, how the risks are going to be shared, is important. It has to be a sustainable project. The tariffs have to be cost reflective, so those are the conversations that have to be had, and you then put in place a platform by which these funds can come in.
Albert, how do you see the flow of investment here? I mean, because one of the fascinating promises of this is that you can invest in one country and have access to 50-odd others. I mean, like in Europe. How do you think that could reignite capital flows into this continent?
I believe, the free trade agreement will certainly boost investment on the continent, and I believe it's going to be really helpful in boosting public-private partnerships. And I think it's so important because by some estimations, Africa needs more than $90 billion per year for investment. And if you factor in public investment and current provisions of resources, we're still left with $48 billion gap in infrastructure. And just to give you an order of magnitude, the whole World Bank IDA window, which is the concessional window for the poorest countries, has mobilized $45 billion for Africa for 3 years, and that has been the record. Which means if we invested the whole IDA resources in 1 year, it wouldn't even be enough to close the financing gap for infrastructure in Africa. So it is crucial for us to actually, work extremely hard to bring in those, those public-private partnerships, bring in private finance in infrastructure. But what is also important to notice, Chris, is this is still a very small market in Africa. We have 4 countries in Africa that represent more than 48% of all the PPPs. It's South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, and Uganda. 48% of all PPPs. So the market is still extremely small, and it is my belief that the implementation of the Continental Free Trade Agreement will boost those private funds into infrastructure.
I know the infrastructure gap, it's one of the things you've spent a lot of time studying, Mr. Kanyako. Well, what do you think the answer is? Do you think it's public-private partnerships?
It's not one answer. You're going to need a commitment of public resources. You will need the public-private partnerships. But you might also just want to open for the private sector to come and play in that space. The point here is that if we think that we're going to close this, sure, we will take advantage of the IDA resources. That is not going to be the big game changer. The big resources are in the private sector, and what we should be thinking about is how do we mobilize private sector resources, not just from the African continent. You've got to be asking ourselves the question, what is our value proposition to holders of capital from elsewhere in the world that we could actually be attracting that capital into our projects? And that, for me, if we change the conversation and start framing the conversation by saying, look, we understand this thing that there are these gaps, but the answer is not going to come from just the official resources. The official resources can go this far, but we actually need to mobilize private sector capital, not just local, but globally.
Shola, also one of the other things that have been raised about this continental free trade area, that it'll be a boon for small businesses, for entrepreneurs, it'll help them attract investment and also help them to grow. How do you see that panning out?
I think Africa is primarily driven by small and medium enterprises, traders, small businesses, and right now you find they're constrained, very constrained. Access to affordable finance, logistics, moving their money around, moving their resources around. We recently partnered with a fintech called Somanini. And what they do is they provide financing to the small informal trader. They allow that small trader to stock up, to access credit, to get financing using mobile payments. Doesn't have to leave his shop, doesn't have to leave his outlet. And what all the regulators, all the policymakers should be focused on, especially on the back of the free trade agreement, is how do we enable these small entrepreneurs? How do we give them the financing they need? How do we make it easier for them to run their businesses? How do we enable the unemployed, the large youth population that we have, to be able to start up businesses and to actually run with it? And with digital infrastructure in place, we are seeing it's easier for these young people, for these small businesses to grow on the back of telecommunications, on the back of access to financing that can be given digitally. So I think that the convergence of all of this will certainly help to drive Africa's growth and to enable the small and medium entrepreneurs to actually grow their businesses.
Albert, if I could put that question to you as an economist, this massive youthful population growing up in this continent, great assets also, if hands are left idle, it could also be a great threat to stability. As an economist, how would you approach getting the continent to work through this free trade area?
Chris, my office just produced a book on the future of work in Africa. And I think it is important to highlight that, having a youthful continent is a huge opportunity, but a huge threat as well. It's a threat if we do not get that population to start really working. And the future of work it will have in Africa to have a digital content. And I think it's important to really emphasize the fact that the work of tomorrow is going to be driven by digital transformation, and we need to first invest in digital infrastructure that is actually lacking on the continent. We estimate that if Africa could just close its digital infrastructure gap, we could actually boost GDP on the continent by a factor of 2.5 percentage points. It is important to invest in digital infrastructure on the continent. So that's one. The second is investing in digital skills as well. And digital skills are not just engineering, coding skills. This starts from the education system at the lower level. It's about teaching all the soft skills, the collaboration, the teamwork skills, which are not necessarily always present in our education system. So these digital skills are going to be absolutely critical. But the other important element on making our youth more productive in Africa is to think of structural transformation moving out of subsistence agriculture. We have now a report at the World Bank showing that poverty is actually essentially, in Africa, essentially a subsistence agriculture problem. 80%, actually 83% to be precise, of our poor in sub-Saharan Africa live from subsistence agriculture. If we're to solve the problem of productive employment, we need to transform our agriculture. We need to move away from subsistence agriculture towards agriculture that is actually more agribusiness than subsistence. And this, again, I see the potential for the Continental Free Trade Agreement to allow Africa to feed itself. Most of those subsistence farmers can grow if they have larger markets, if they can actually have the right infrastructure to access those markets across the continent. And that certainly, I hope, would happen.
Which brings us smartly to our next theme, the fourth industrial revolution, one of the big themes here at the World Economic Forum. Shola, if I could come to you, I want to talk about exactly how it could change the game again. Just the other day, I was interviewing a gentleman from Angola here, and he telling me a story which I couldn't have believed when I first went to Angola in 1994 to report on the war. The country was virtually obliterated. He was saying that they're putting undersea cables so farmers in Brazil can control the irrigation of their crops in their fields in Angola, which is unbelievable. It's something that I found amazing. How do you think this is going to come more and more into the world of economics and business here in Africa?
Yeah, I think the fourth industrial revolution is going to disrupt all sectors. That's clear. And, but it's also an opportunity. And I think Africa needs to take advantage of that opportunity. We raised some financing for Mkopa Solar. It's a solar off-grid company run out of Kenya. And they've been able to connect 500,000 homes with off-grid solar panels, and the consumers pay as you go. We raised $55 million for them, and they intend to increase that to 1 million homes. Add another 1 million homes to that, and that is a combination of finance, technology, renewable energy, and they are achieving what. Very easily what the large energy infrastructure projects haven't been able to achieve. So I think technological disruption is good in every single sector, and hopefully it will help us to better address and find solutions to the many problems we have on the continent.
Mr. Kenyago, the fourth industrial revolution is upon us. What changes do you see for good or ill? I take you to the words of Amina Mohammed, the Deputy Secretary General of the UN, who is here. She said the picture has shadow as well as light when it comes to the fourth industrial revolution. How do you see it?
I see a lot of light. The point here is that every big revolution that we have seen, you can look at the previous ones and say that the elements of the next one are always getting seen in the previous one. And I don't know, it would be a matter of time before we start talking about the fifth industrial revolution. There might be elements of it already in the fourth industrial revolution. Well, one sees lots of opportunities, and I think that for the continent, the early aspects of it and the biggest, where the continent actually leapfrogged, had actually been in financial services. In many respects, Africa became a leader in mobile payments and all of that stuff. And in those respects, I think the example that was given earlier, you are going to see that kind of leapfrogging taking place. I think that the important thing for me is the conversations that we are going to have with labor and organized labor. Because many of them are in denial and they think that you can fight this fourth industrial revolution instead of asking how do we embrace this and how do we engage with it differently. And for me, the way in which governments have got to think about it is to think about it like when you are doing a major structural reform program, that whilst as a whole we will be winners, there are going to be some losers. And so when there are some losers, how do you take care of the losers, because they could actually potentially cause trouble? And I want us to move from the logic that says that, which is the logic advanced by organized labor, to say that you must protect jobs. We are already facing high unemployment. Let us protect the jobs. You can't protect jobs. You can't protect jobs. It's just a wrong approach. We can protect people, and that is what we should be focusing on. And saying that in the transition, as the fourth industrial revolution sets in, there are people, there are skills that are disappearing because they are no longer relevant. And what programs, what interventions do governments put in place to transition people from the old jobs to the new skills in the fourth industrial revolution? And if our focus is going to be, we must protect jobs, then we are going to fail. We can protect people, and that is what we need in order to make the transition.
Albert, if I come to you as an economist, I mean, I think Mr. Kenyago is right. The unions, the labor movement, is not likely to be very kind when it comes to the fourth industrial revolution. I was looking at some World Economic Forum research yesterday, said for every job lost, 1.79 jobs will be created. I don't know what 0.79 of a job is, but I'm sure the labor movement is not going to be that much. How do you see that playing out? Because, as you know, it's very, very strong on this continent.
That's right. Chris, the research we just completed and published in this Future of Work is actually pointing to the fact that there is more light than shadow. In fact, we find that the fourth industrial revolution will create more jobs than it will destroy on the continent of Africa. And there are many reasons for that, and I may not get into all those details, but you should read the book for sure. But we do find that there are a couple of myths to dispel here. First is to think of that fourth industrial revolution as something that will come in the future. It's already here. Africa is already leapfrogging. And if you don't believe me, ask the people in the financial sector in Kenya, ask the people in the health sector in Rwanda and Ghana how the digital is disrupting the way people work, the way we deliver services, right? So it's already here and it's happening. Second myth is to think of that fourth industrial revolution as a sector as opposed to existing ones, as opposed to manufacturing or opposed to agriculture or others. It's in fact the case that digital transformation is a cross-cutting phenomenon that has the potential to raise productivity across sectors. So even if you are in agriculture and even if you are illiterate, digital transformation can actually increase your productivity. That's what we are finding. And we're doing a lot of research and a lot of work that's going to be, again, published, in the next year. We are finding a lot of hope that digital transformation will create more jobs in Africa than it will destroy. But there is one concern, Chris. My biggest concern about the digital transformation and the fourth industrial revolution in Africa is it going to be done without Africans? Or what role will African companies, African startups, African inventors play? To me, that's the biggest challenge.
Well, Shola, I mean, we've been mentioned here in the financial sector, it's growing, it's fast. Just give us your take on it and how it is changing already our world.
Yes, I mean, big disruption, and everybody is trying to get into the financial services sector. But, it's a huge opportunity as well, and we are collaborating with our competitors, as well as competing with our competitors. We recently invested in Founders Factory Africa, which is an incubator, accelerator for fintechs on the continent. And already there are fintechs who are devising solutions under Founders Factory Africa in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Uganda, in Kenya, across the health sector, across education. And it's exciting. You go to Kenya and the whole ecosystem, they call it the Silicon Savannah, enables the growth of innovation and technology. So we think it's exciting. And, there will be winners and losers, but ultimately efficiency is up, costs are lower, people experience greater value. And therefore, I think that it's a momentum that is building, and the important thing is to make sure that, as the convergence continues, the whole world really is going to be operating on platforms, and you have to get on that platform.
Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but one last quick comment from yourself, Mr. Kanyaho, on this fourth industrial revolution.
I think that one of the things that is understated is the impact that it would have on the efficiency with which governments can deliver public services. And I think that for me it's a big issue. We had a pilot project in South Africa that we called Project Coca, where we used blockchain technology in our payment systems space. And the South African payment systems clears a couple of trillions of rands a day. And we were able to clear the amount of transactions that we clear for the whole day. We were able to clear them in 90 minutes. Now, think of the efficiency gains from that and what it would actually mean. And this was in the wholesale market. But if we were to roll that out across the country, think of the speed with which people could actually move money and the reduced risk of settlement in the payment space.
Well, on that hopeful note, we close. Thank you very much to my esteemed guest, Lesetja Kganyago, the Governor of South Africa's Reserve Bank, Shola David Bohar, the CEO of Standard Bank, and Albert Zufak, the Chief Economist for Africa from the World Bank. And for me, Chris Bishop, the editor of CNBC Africa, it's thank you very much for watching and goodbye.
only going to be one camera. Remove the banner. Remove this one as well.
Oh, this is not for SABC.
able to be in not just providing advice to governments and formulating policy, but in making things happen.
Yeah, thank you first of all also for being here. I'm very delighted to participate in the panel. So as you already said, I mean, we're quite a long time on the continent, means we have a pretty endurance, but as a company, you know, as what you can manage within your own frame is normally isolate on individual countries, yeah? But if you look at the demand which is coming into Africa, particular, the discussion you pointed out is that there is a regional integration required. A company can't necessarily enable all of this because the pity of Africa is that you have a patchwork of legislation, particular to integrate country borders is not as simple because, you know, country borders create taxes. Taxes are income for countries which are already have very little income from their revenue generated. Hence, they are very scared to let that go. And to work on these kind of regional aspects, it is beyond of what a legal entity or a company can do because we are not seen to be the facilitator, particular between governments. And we see that partnering up with institutions like, for instance, the Nepal Business Foundation helps a lot because they're seen as a neutral facilitator, and that is a beyond individual company aspect association. So you will have people which are all related to your kind of intention you want to achieve. One project, for instance, and that goes also to what you highlighted right now, border controlling, is the North-South corridor from Durban to Ndola. You have to go through 3 countries. It is something where you needed to have the legislation adjusted between all 3 countries, means South Africa, Zimbabwe and Zambia, to allow actually free flow of goods and a carriage. And that was only possible because you had a neutral facilitator, because in the ordinary course, governments are very suspicious if a company like us would come along and say, I'll help you here, yeah? So they do want to have this neutral aspect, and I believe this kind of engagement on facilitation in the sense of really being a neutral position, getting government parties together, not feeling worried, or institutions together, not feeling worried that the private sector wants to overtake them in their endeavor of doing their own job and infringing on their revenue collection, yeah?
Well, you bring up several interesting points. I mean, you talk about being the facilitators in a positive sense, but listening to some of the heads of states gathered here yesterday, the South African president was talking about the problem of corruption, and in a way he also raised the issue of the private sector quite often facilitating in the negative sense of the ongoing culture of corruption that seems to exist in Africa. I'd like you to address this, and also the issue of how you deal with this other aspect of being not just a private sector, and how the governments may look at you suspiciously or not, because in the end, they need to work closely with you, but how civil society and the private sector in the country, the indigenous companies might look at a foreign entity rather suspiciously in seeing them as being there simply for the short-term economic benefits.
Yeah, so if you look, for instance, on the corruption aspect, so there are certain areas where, you know, it is the ethical behavior of what you entrench in your entity, yeah? So we only do clean business, means all the business which we do, cross-border activities, are subject to clean activities. So we don't pay at border post a bribe, yeah? We will only pick freight forwarders which do it properly and rather come back. If I can't get it legally over the border, then you go. Because as long as you keep feeding that animal, yeah, it will never stop. But it also means, particular also when you look at regional integration projects, we need to deal with the fact that individuals currently have the power to demand or have the need to demand, because often there's an economic reason to why they want to have a benefit than rather being really something of a greedy position in that context. So I believe when you have that kind of engagement and have a cross business and cross-country collaboration and address particular the individual needs of these people, which are somehow have a little power, yeah? That is one of the vital aspects to change something. On the other hand, if you believe the way on how we can work as a company in a context where Siemens can be successful, or how we integrate society, you know, for us, it's something we here since 160 years. We would not be here if we would have done only quarter by quarter business. For us, the topic, and luckily in South Africa through Black Economic Empowerment, enterprise development is something what is entrenched into companies' behavior. But enterprise development in our context is something absolutely vital, because if we don't care about the small, medium enterprises around us, we are not able to do all jobs ourselves. You need to know how a society works, where you go. If you go to a community, they want to participate. You know, if you go and you build a rail track, if you go and you build a power plant, and they see there is this massive investment coming in, and I sit next to the road and I have nothing to eat, now sure they want to participate. And that engagement is absolutely vital, and we do that actively.
So an engagement that goes beyond the financial rewards that are associated with these projects. Popo Molefe, you are chairman of Transnet, which is South Africa's state-owned port, rail, and pipeline company. Your company has been planning a liquefied natural gas LNG terminal at the port of Richards Bay. I know the timeline for the completion of this is 2024, so 5 years from now. It does require the input of the private sector, not just to invest, but also to manage this facility. I wonder how that partnership has been working out and how easy it has been to achieve.
Well, it's a new, sorry, I forgot. it's the LPG project at Richards Bay. It's a new development, a new approach by Transnet, and it has required that Transnet works closely with other energy organizations, such as the CEF Group, the iGas, the Strategic Fuel Fund, as well as Petro SA. But from the point of view of Transnet, we're more interested in building the infrastructure and creating opportunities for the private sector to access it. To the extent that the private sector wants to work with us in investing in that infrastructure, we will partner with them. As you might be aware, we're already working with the IFC in doing the feasibility study, the report of which should be ready this month, and we should be able to hit the ground running thereafter.
And as you mentioned, the IFC has already committed $2 million to this
Yes.
feasibility study. But looking at what the investment is all about, how much of an attractive solution is natural gas to help countries diversify their power generation away from heavy coal consumption and unreliable power generation? I wonder if it isn't a missed opportunity in many respects to concentrate on the development of LNG, even though I know that Africa has a few countries that have now become not just importers but exporters of this, and has about 7.1% of the global base of LNG. How much of a missed opportunity is it to not have leapfrogged towards renewables?
Well, Fakri, we're clearly behind time, but the challenge is now. We've got to do it now. We've got no choice. And we see that LNG project as also giving us the opportunity to respond to some of the challenges that ESCOM is facing. So we need to be able to use that to create energy that can supplement what ESCOM is doing, but also to create economies of scale by allowing space for operators, traders, who trade in the molecule more than really being part of the infrastructure and reaching out to the local people at cost-effective prices.
So you mentioned the local people and the issue of making all of these projects inclusive. Lois Auta, you are the founder and executive director of Cedar Seed Foundation in Nigeria. This is an organization that fights for the rights of people living with disability. You're also a young global leader. So as we talk about infrastructure projects, the huge investments that go in, at the end of the day, they're all supposedly done for the benefit of local populations. Looking at people with disabilities across Africa, how much do you feel that you are included in the discussion, or perhaps not? Do you feel that some of the basic needs of your community are even taken into consideration when these projects are being finalized and implemented?
Actually, I'm not impressed. In the world, we have 1 billion persons with disabilities. In Africa, 80 million plus. In Nigeria, we have 25.3 persons with disabilities. And for too long, persons with disabilities have been excluded, discriminated, and underrepresented in the infrastructural development. The UNCRPD, Article 9 to be precise, which talks about accessibility, the SDGs on Goal 9 that talks about infrastructure, and the Nigerian Disability Act also talks about inclusive infrastructure, which it has not been implemented. Persons with disabilities do not have access to road transport, air transport, as it should. There are no road signs on the road to be able to guide them to move around independently on the road, in the air, and so on. So, to speak from my heart, I am not impressed with the way infrastructure is being managed.
So you are not impressed. Why is it that the situation is where it's at, especially within the African context, that it is not part of the discussion, the debate, or the culture to take into account the basic needs of people with disabilities? I presume you're talking about such basic things as simply finding a ramp in airports and other places to move from place A to place B. Does it have to do with just the government's lack of willingness and interest, or also with some kind of underlying stigma from society that is still bubbling under the surface, which makes it also an issue of not great importance to many?
Yeah, sign language interpreters are not at the airport to guide the hearing impaired. Braille materials are not also provided, and ramps are not provided for wheelchair users. So persons with disabilities need to move around independently from point A to point B, but those structures are not provided. So the government, the private and the public sectors need to come together and work with disabled people organizations, ask them questions, what they need to do to make the infrastructural facilities inclusive and accessible.
And I think, Lois, what you're saying also raises the question of implementation, because I know there are laws and rules in place, I know in your own country, in Nigeria, but within the United Nations framework that safeguard the rights and well-being of people with disability, whether it's in African countries or around the world. So we'll get to the issue of implementation in just a few minutes, but if I could first maybe take a few questions from around the room, because again, we do want this discussion to be inclusive and to hear from everyone sitting around the room who's got questions to raise. Please go ahead.
My name is Anne Linde. I'm the Minister of Trade of... Sorry, take it again. My name is Anne Linde. I'm the Minister of Trade of Sweden. And I think this is a very interesting discussion. I come from a country that is built on the mining and forestry industry, and we are actually aware of the industrial potential in an upgraded regional infrastructure in Africa. Our own landmark investment into an efficient railway system was one of the key drivers of sustainable growth of Sweden. My government is ready to finance efficient and sustainable transport infrastructure projects across Europe. We are actively seeking local partnership, and our know-how can be included in an early stage. So my question is, how can Sweden be catalytical in assisting building master plans and implementing large infrastructure projects in the region? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Popo Molefe, you perhaps want to take this question, and I just want to add as well that in Africa, the imports for infrastructure for railways has actually grown quite a bit in the last few years, since 2012, I think steadily at 10%. So there is significant investment in this domain. What do you say to this call for partnership from governments such as Sweden?
It's a welcome suggestion and offer from Sweden. We are promoting inter-African trade, and to that extent building connectivities with the rail to ports. We're doing work with Botswana through Lepalale to Richards Bay, busy with the Swazi-South Africa rail corridor. There is a Maputo corridor. We're working on the North-South corridor, which is a project that the African Union had mandated South Africa to be the champion of on rolling stock and rail development. So we should be able to partner, and there are many other countries I have been privileged to visit in recent times who are willing to partner with us. There have been some difficulties, of course, in terms of the red tape imposed by the Public Finance Management Act, because we are a state-owned company. So in those instances, we would then be required to be a minority partner in order to circumvent the requirement of Section 54 of the Public Finance Management Act. But we welcome this opportunity, and we're ready to engage in practical discussions.
Ready to engage. Any other question? While I also look at you, Mr. Ayer, and talk to you perhaps about the idea of developing the railway system in a way that meets the needs of the 21st century. In Africa, I know there are only 2 fully fledged metro systems, I believe, in Algiers and in Cairo. Is that also something that investors are looking to do within the African context?
Yeah, I mean, if I may just make a quick response to that point. I mean, when we talk about regional infrastructure, we think about connecting countries. But I think it is also now quite imperative that we look at connecting cities. I don't mean it in a physical sense, but the cities are growing, the needs of cities are growing, from water to waste management to transport. There are huge needs. So cities within Africa can actually collaborate with each other, learn from each other, and actually implement projects. And this offer from Sweden is a very good offer in terms of looking at how Africa can look at maybe 20, 30 years from now, what are the types of connectivity that would be required to make trade and movement of people and goods flow very easily. And I think we should think about regions not just as countries, but also as cities and states that need to work with each other.
Maybe to add to the offer behind me from Sweden.
Does Germany have an equally strong offer?
Yeah, no. But I think, from a European point of view, particular on how to enable trade in Africa, is one of the key levers. Because if you have a rail network, then you need to have loads for all ferries going in and going out. But the problem is that often in the African context, the way and how the economies are developed is about extraction. So you have commodities going out, which doesn't matter how long it takes actually to get them to shore, right? And there will be market on a global market. So I think particular from a European point of view, I think it's important to understand how Africa can participate in their value chain, and how you can have exports from Africa being allowed to come into your country, so that actually that kind of return is commercially viable, because nobody will invest in Africa just for the sake of the people, and that is unfortunately the situation, because it needs to be a commercial aspect. And if you look at many development in Europe of the last 100 years, it has happened because it was a new technology. Governments want to demonstrate that they are in the leap and in the front row of technology development, while in Africa we don't have that scenario.
Molefe, there's also the issue of the financial constraints. I mean, these massive infrastructure projects on a global level need to be financed, and we all know that many African countries, indeed many countries around the world, are struggling currently with limited budgets and financial constraints. We heard yesterday the president of the Seychelles talk about the uneven economic development within the continent. He referred to just one country being a high-income country. So where is the money coming from, and where do we need to look to when governments are in need for these kinds of investments?
The point that Sabina raises is an important one. The projects must be designed in such a way that there are returns for those who put their money in, and returns for the countries in which the projects are done. And therefore, the question of volumes of the cargo that you move from one point to the other must be such that it can give returns to that country and put that country together with its partners in a position to pay back the loans that they take. But also you need a concession that extends for longer periods, so that it makes sense for an investor and it becomes attractive to an investor to want to attract. From our side as Transnet.
To attract and maintain the investment.
I beg your pardon?
To attract and maintain.
Attract and maintain investment. From our point, I mean, we are a company with an asset base of over 370 billion. We generate over 74 billion rand. So we are able to generate revenue, and therefore we can attract investors, and we don't depend on bailouts from the government. So we want to partner, therefore, with the private sector to achieve that objective, and I think we will be able to get it. We need bankable projects, and you know, financiers will come.
But again, South Africa perhaps in a much stronger position than many other countries in the region. Let me take another question from the audience.
Bonjour, je vais...
Hello, everyone. I speak French, if you will. I happen to come from Equatorial Guinea, which is Spanish-speaking, but I think for the purpose of this particular forum, I'll speak French. I've got a comment and a question in that order. I'll wait so that each and everybody, especially the speakers, can have their microphones and their headphones on. My comment relates to the situation that's prevailing in our region, particularly in my country. It was mentioned that all countries are not the same level of development in Africa. It so happens that in my country we have got very good infrastructures, especially as far as roads are concerned, and in the process of finalizing the construction of a hydroelectric power plant. And we also have got a wonderful airport. The question which I wanted to ask is how we can make these infrastructures profitable. This is one of the difficulties that, in fact, one of the major difficulties we have in our countries. We busy constructing more roads so that we can have better links with surrounding countries, namely Cameroon and Gabon. But the issue we have is how to make these infrastructures profitable. I'd also like to ask a question to our sister who mentioned that we do not take into account the issues of handicapped people when we are laying down infrastructure. I wanted to share the experience of my country, Equatorial Guinea, if you will. I think it should be compulsory to take into account the issues of disabled people so that they can have access to all infrastructure. This includes, of course, all public offices and hospitals. They have also got a right to work and be able to have to access all kinds of infrastructure around the country. Thank you very much.
Question and observation about Equatorial Guinea, the situation there when it comes to infrastructure projects, doing relatively well, but also this idea of inclusion and why investments may or may not feel attracted to projects that need to take into account the inclusion of people with disability.
Yeah. On the inclusion point, I think Lois made the point that infrastructure, new infrastructure, when it is created, is also creating some inequities in access to that infrastructure. So when we build a highway, we think about the cars that will be using that highway. We very rarely think about the pedestrians who will have to walk a kilometer or more to cross the road because the crossings are only put a mile apart and there is no access to cross the road. So I think in planning and executing infrastructure, the issue of access, that we are not creating new inequities through the construction of new infrastructure is very critical, and I fully agree with Lois that the inclusion aspect of infrastructure is very critical to make it work for all.
Yeah.
On the point about the ensuring returns from infrastructure investments, I think it is critical. If we are asking private sector to come and invest in infrastructure, even for governments, if they invest public money in infrastructure, the returns have to be there because these assets have to pay for themselves. The problem is that most of these infrastructure assets, she mentioned a hydropower plant. A hydropower plant money is recovered over a 40-year period, 30 to 40-year period. Transmission infrastructure, road infrastructure, you recover the money over 30 to 40 years. Investors want returns in the next 7 years, 8 years, 10 years, and they don't have the patience or the patient capital to stay in that project for 30 or 40 years. So even though you may have a 20-year contract, there has to be a mechanism within the projects to make sure that some of the returns are front-loaded and that governments step in with providing the support and the assurance that those returns, those revenues will flow, interruptions would be managed so that the asset is able to deliver the returns. And only when a country has a number of well-functioning projects, will it be able to attract more investments? So it's a cycle. You have to get into that virtuous cycle of getting stable. You mentioned maintain. It's very important. It's not just important to attract, but it has to sustain and maintain, and that track record has to be built up over time.
Do I have another quick question around the room? In the meantime, perhaps, Lois, can I ask you quickly to put on your hat of being a young global leader, civil society basically feeling that African governments need to set the rules, enforce the rules. You and I spoke about the need for implementation when we met yesterday, saying that this is really what is lacking, and get out of the way. That quite often governments tend to be in the way of business and activity by young entrepreneurs and stifle activity that could lead the way forward. Your views on this while I take another question after your response.
Yeah. Government needs to work with disabled people organizations, ask them of their needs, and also ensure that those needs and their rights, disabled rights, are given to them. We want to see offices that are inclusive. We want to see schools that are inclusive. We want to see public offices like parks and gardens and other places being inclusive. Persons with disabilities have the rights, they have the potentials, they have what it takes to contribute to their national development. And do you know...
Is part of the problem the fact that many of them are not in the decision-making
Yes.
processes? They're not involved as CEO of enterprises or government cabinet ministers. Is that one of the problems?
Yes, they are not involved in decision-making processes. And when they come out to vie for positions, they are not given the opportunities and the support because people see them as charity, not as rights. That's why I'm going to talk about the models of disability, the charity model, the social model, and the human rights model. And as it is, Africa is still operating on the charity model.
Looking at this more as charity than as an investment in an important part of the community. One final quick question before I ask the panelists to wrap up with their final thoughts.
Yes,
quick question.
Thank you very much. My name is Manali Ratsuma from the New Development Bank. Dr. Molefe introduces a very critical point on infrastructure, which is about preparation. As a development bank, we found a lot of struggle in finding ready projects for investment. We had $2 billion to deploy this year alone, and we've struggled to find the projects. We find that when you engage with governments many a times and across the board, in terms of headlines, absolute numbers run into trillions in projects. When you drill deeper, you find very, very little ready projects. I think, we'd like to get a sense of, perhaps a challenge that for those that have got available resources, much of it could be dedicated to preparation of projects.
All right, so let me ask you, Popo Molefe, to address this point and wrap up with a few final thoughts, if you would.
Well, we as you are aware, that we are, as Transnet, we have been going through a rigorous process of restructuring, enhancing operational efficiencies, putting in place new operating model, and we will be looking at the new business model, how Transnet should look in the future, given the global changes in how business is run. So from our side, I know I've met with you a few times. Going forward, we should be able to address some of those challenges, but we can do them in partnership with our neighbors. For example, if we have to do the 800 kilometers of rail, I think it's from Ndola to link up with with our north-south corridor and link up with DR Congo, Zimbabwe. We would need the government of Zambia to commit to dealing with regulatory framework and undertaking that they too will play their part in that infrastructure investments, and probably then they could access funding from the new development bank, as you say. We are building, changing the paradigm. We have 10 years of struggle in South Africa. We were bashed. We spoke about corruption earlier on in the introduction. We are reversing those effects. And because now we have leaders, presidents of these countries, championing infrastructure investments and good governance and the anti-corruption fight, I think the future should look better.
The future should look better, Mr. Ayer. How bright does the future look from an investment perspective? By 2035, Sub-Saharan Africa will have the planet's largest workforce. The population, as I mentioned, is also very young. The African age of the average age of an African is 19.5 years, I believe, compared to 42.5 for the average EU citizen. So a lot of potential, but how bright does the future look from your perspective?
I think two aspects of the future give me a lot of hope. One, you mentioned it already, there is a growing youth aspiration, and it's the young population that is entrepreneurial, innovative. I think putting the right skills and the right tools in their hands will promise a much better future. The other thing that gives me hope and inspires a lot of confidence is that governments are getting better at cooperating, collaborating with each other and finding solutions. The Continental Free Trade Agreement is a good example of that. Countries, when they grow alone, take a longer time, but when they collaborate and grow together, there is a much faster pace of growth. And I see that happening more and more with increasing digital access and digital flow of information and e-commerce and the young population and governments willing to collaborate more with each other. I think that we can hope for a much better future for regional infrastructure, regional integration, and the investments that have to come with it.
Sabina, you're equally optimistic. Is there really a joint common strategy that you can see taking shape in Africa?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at the projects which are going forward, and Popo mentioned some of them in the rail space, but also in the electricity space, you see a much stronger growing together of economies, like for instance in East Africa, in Southern Africa, where countries really work together because they have understood they have to go together, because otherwise the scale Africa can produce is not significant to make a dent anywhere in the global economy. So I'm rather optimistic. It is a long stretch. Yeah, we are nowhere close. We only started going into that direction, but there is a lot of opportunity, and I believe that also in the context of the global environment, particular with regards to Europe, there is a strong wake-up call that Africa cannot be forgotten, yeah? And there are changes, and I always like the Ethiopian example of where you look at the coffee producer, and the two largest, one of the top three is Switzerland of roasted coffee, Switzerland and Germany, and to my understanding, not one bean is growing there, right? But they had import taxes on commodities like that you could not enter the market. They have changed it, and hopefully that will change also the way on how we can, as African markets, access European markets.
All right, on this positive note, we'll have to leave our discussion. Let me thank all of our panelists, Louis Sauta, Sabine Dalomo, Popo Molefe, and Vijay Ayer. Thank you all very much indeed, and thank you for joining us and sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you very much.
Enough to get a few people to get their response or their reaction to the passing of the late Robert Mugabe. And I'm joined in our studio by Benita Diop. She's the African Union envoy for women and children. Thanks very much, ma'am, for joining us. Just a quick response from you, a reaction on the passing of Robert Mugabe.
As an African woman, I think today is we are all mourning because Mugabe is an icon in the continent. In 2015, the continent, the African Union, have elected him to be the chair of the African Union. And I think it's because Mugabe has done a lot he's a freedom fighter. He's somebody that have been in the revolution, in the transformation of this continent, and everybody recognized that. And I think it was good for the leaders of Africa to say, yes, before you pass away, we want to recognize you as a leader of the continent. I think that is what we need to remember today on that. But there is also a lesson we should learn on the trajectory of Mugabe. Being a freedom fighter, having liberated his country, but also the fact that our leaders stay too long in power. Because there is life after power. And that is where maybe, if there is a mistake that, we need to tell our elders that at a certain time, you don't retire from power. It means that you continue to do something else for this continent.
Yes.
There are so many conflicts going on, and we need the wise men that have a lot of experience, that continue to be the elders,
yes,
and to transmit their knowledge to the younger generation. We have new young leaders in the continent,
yes,
that are in the government, that are in governance, and people like Mugabe should, on a certain time, retire and make sure not retire from the power, but retire to make sure that they are also servicing the continent, the Africa. So I think that is today what we remember. Maybe there was a missed opportunity, what we have seen in Zimbabwe. Maybe also we will put some criticism on the kind of leadership that at the end of the day we have seen. But I think in the whole, Africa, we like to celebrate our old people,
yes,
our elders, and what we remember is a freedom fighter, somebody who speaks his mind. And I remember seeing him sitting hours and hours, sometimes sleepy, that's real, but also sometimes waking up and telling the truth to the whole world. And there are certain times you need that. You need somebody who is wise enough, somebody who's old enough who can tell something that everybody loves and everybody say at the same time it is serious issues, and we need to address it. So I think it's a mourning day today for all over Africa. We lost a son of this continent, and I think that it's all over Africa we will remember President Mugabe.
Madam, thank you very much for your response. As I mentioned there, that's Benita Diop. She's the AU envoy for women and children, just giving us her response, her reaction on the passing of Robert Mugabe. Back to you, Blaine. Thank you, Mummy.
Thank you.
Nice, eh?
Thank you.
Hello, sexy.
All right, how you doing?
I'm fine, how are you?
So you up next? You on next? What do you reckon?
Well, I'm waiting. Well, we've got a possible interview. So, yeah, so when he comes,
Okay.
yeah, so,
I'm Mr. Oh, sorry, yes, 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 yes. You do not have to attend that, so
no.
All right, anyway, you okay?
Yeah, I'm good.
That's all right. That's all right. I was talking to Nathan last night. Tell him to send the contract. Don't do anything.
What's new, eh?
Launch pad
Yeah,
now,
no,
right?
she is, eh?
No, no.
I was telling her that she's doing very well.
But she's just landed in the right place at the right time.
Yes, yes, yes. Oh, is it?
She used to be like, she used to come, I worked with Eleni like 11 years ago.
Okay, yeah.
So we used to go on these things and she'd come with like
Okay.
quiz nights and things. Those are the days.
Oh my God.
Have it against the star. They like Guardian, we had to just compete with each other. And anyway, she was I said, mate, don't do that, mate. There's no money in it. Because people will hate you forever. I know, she's here. I said, think about it. She's just
She'll grow out of it and find out.
she'll be fine. Anyway, I think 8 o'clock, I think, our flight.
Oh, okay, guys.
See you.
Good to see you.
Okay.
Sure, sure. Okay. How is it? I'm fine. Oh, I'm good, darling. We're just about to do the president of Namibia. That's how we roll. You doing that? Yeah. Gerald? Please ask because when he comes, don't want this thing of them sitting here for 10 minutes. The president of Namibia is coming.
Okay. Is he coming 10 minutes?
I'm sure he's coming now. It's nearly finished. Okay. And then what happens is they sit here, it's uncomfortable. Just want to ask him one question. Boom, fine.
One question only. One question only.
Are you going to marry me? Are you going to marry me? I'm waiting for you. Come and make me up. She's
like really?
yes, I did some makeup. You're jealous. You're jealous. Now.
Huh?
Yeah, they've agreed, they've
Yes.
confirmed, and then they said you can ask him on the comments on the passing of Mugabe.
Yes.
And then the Namibian participation in the F.
Okay, okay,
Yeah,
yes.
about 5 minutes.
Okay, no problem. Okay, that's fine. Thanks, darling.
12th. So we'll pre-contemplate at 12th. Just looking at the situation in the country, how is South Africa branding and how are they handling all the challenges that's happening. You can ask about tomorrow.
What's happening?
Yeah. I'm going to see how guys gonna come.
Hello, sir. How are you? I'm fine, my darling. We've got a little bit of a confusion because the president of Namibia is supposed to be coming, but I think we must just do the gentleman.
Yeah.
The gentleman.
Because I'm going to see the shine package, see if it happens or not.
No problem. No problem. Oh, on SABC too, on Morning Live. Yes. I was like forgetting my...
Yeah, I heard.
It's very hard, this job, you know?
I know.
Unless you're reading an auto cue.
So now you're giving me double trouble. Now you're making me really nervous.
Otherwise, how's it going?
Right.
How has it gone? It's not good. I actually do know your name, but I forgot. I want to give me your... Okay. Yeah, lady, let's record nice. Hi. Thank you, Madam. Yes. No, yes. You just look at me, yes, and yeah. Thanks very much. I'm joined in studio by Jeff Rothschild, and he's from Brand SA, just to get his perspective on how the WEF meetings have gone and how it's been to project South Africa in the last while, given all the events that have been taking place. Thanks very much, sir, for joining us.
Thank you.
So obviously we didn't have the best press at the beginning of the week when WEF started. We had the young girls coming to protest around all the violence against women and children at the beginning of the week, and of course we had the violence against fellow Africans here in the country. How difficult has it been for Brand SA to project itself to the meeting here?
Well, obviously one's got to be real. And there are problems. I mean, the reality is the pictures we see in the newspaper or on the TV or experience. So it is difficult. There is skittishness. As we're all aware, some of the heads of state did not come for the conference.
Yes.
Generally speaking, though, one had to do the best under the circumstances. And I think the way the president has reacted is pretty positive. Obviously, you're not going to satisfy everybody because there are underlying problems. And the question is, how do those arise?
Yes.
Do they arise through the joblessness? Do they arise through the violence against women and children? And, the question is, one's got to get to the bottom of it. And only this morning I experienced that the Western Hotel have set up a grouping of ladies to sort out and discuss amongst themselves and with management and most probably with the male staff just exactly how they're going to deal with what they're facing.
Yes.
Because obviously their staff wanted to go out and join the, can I call them, protesters today. And they've said, let's talk about it. Let's try and see if we can make a difference.
Yes.
And I think the biggest thing that's happened around this for the benefit of us in the country is that we're talking.
Yes, absolutely.
And people are beginning to appreciate. And there are a lot of people who are disgusted by what's going on. It's not only in South Africa, to my horror here, it's all over the world that femicide is going on. It's unacceptable.
Yes, absolutely.
And we've got to get involved to change it. But
So,
it's not a matter of looking over there. It's actually a matter of each one of ourselves looking at ourselves and saying, what are we promoting?
that's right. So beyond the headline news and the stuff that has really kind of overshadowed this meeting, what have the exchanges been like at the meeting for Brand SA, and are people still positive about possibly investing in South Africa?
Yes, there's a definite possibility. So let's start with the Brand South Africa doing the breakfast with the President. Very well attended, very well commented on, and it was a wonderful opportunity for him to address the audience. It was a full room, most probably about 120 people, and heavy, can I call them heavy hitters or people in business. So that was good. And what for me also stood out is our Minister of Communications, who did a breakfast the following day talking about AI and the reality of what AI is all about and how it's got to permeate not through just the young people but through the older generation, and that one needs to change behavior.
Yes.
We're not in a world which is about jobs. We're in a world where we can create our own futures. And how are we going to do that? It's not a matter of going to an institution and getting a job for life anymore. It's a matter of what are you going to do to be entrepreneurial and do something that you have a passion for and that has a meaning in society and that you can earn a living and bring up a family.
You're also a businessman. What are your thoughts about the South African economy? Can we turn our economy around?
There's no answer is it's not possible. It's a matter of how. And I think there's opportunity. I think it can be done. Obviously, we've got to change attitude. Obviously, we've got a mountain to climb because a lot of things have gone wrong. There's a lot of criticism of recent years and what's gone on. Behavior in many of the, can we call it corporates and public sector, of unacceptable practices, morality and ethics just not at the right level. And we've got to get people to understand and to change behavior. But behavior changes only comes with leadership. And we, as South Africans, I think everybody at the moment is crying out for action.
Absolutely. All right, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us. As I mentioned, that was Jeff Rothschild. He's the chairman at Control Risks, and he also is representing Brand SA. Baba.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, my love.
Was that all right?
That was perfect. Except you speak very, very faintly, but I'm sure this picked you up. Well, I've got your card anyway. Thank you so much.
Thank you very
Take
much
care.
for being here. Thanks for being here.
Okay. He's right here. It's just not sure when he's coming towards us.
Actually, I did something upstairs that was exactly the same thing we waited for.
Okay, that's exactly what we want. Just a one-liner. I don't know if he'll give us a one-liner. I didn't want to ask you that because I don't know what your views are, and I don't want to. Yeah. Yes, exactly. Then that would be it, yeah. The rest we can have a chat over a pint of beer. Okay,
Thank you so
bye-bye.
much. Then it's all
Then you can have your
sports right.
for instance, I don't. It's very so, man.
Okay.
If I'm one of it, so at least because now we can't come in live.
okay.
At least mom would have to say,
Yeah,
I bambe nyana jobo. Please, ne?
You know what? I did notice that, but it was difficult because I would have had to say it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, okay, all right, yeah, because I could see his mic was far from his face, but I just thought, eesh, yeah. He asked me, he said, did that go well? I said, it did, except you speak very faint. That's what I said to him. Come. Noms. Noms. Mpobi? Mpobi.
We have a busy day today, surprisingly.
I thought we were going to chill today. Why did Robert die this morning? Why did Robert
But
die?
it's like, I was thinking, okay, since he died, like, looks like, but it's even busy in here.
Hi, my name is Veli, the Minister of Economic Development in the Republic of South Africa.
But did you train as when you were studying?
I did a degree in law and I did a master's in journalism.
So you are a trained journalist.
You can call it trained, yeah. Why? Come. How do you say his first name? Agi.
Hey! Let me go ask.
Yeah, go and ask again how he says it. No, I said to him, you must just check again how he says it.
It's a Hage.
Hage Gengob, yeah. Hage, I know the Gengob bit, but
Hage Gengob.
Hage
Hey, it's very difficult.
Hage?
Like you are tempted to say
Hage.
Hage Gengob.
Yeah, Hage.
Thank you.
No, but when I
You
start,
have- yeah,
I have
you
to
have to-
introduce him. Yeah. Yeah, but what? Yes.
Yeah, first time you need to get it
President of-
right.
Yeah, president. I can't just say president of Namibia. I have to say his name. And then when I'm talking to him.
Gengob.
Yes, the president's coming now. Yeah. No? Yeah. Yeah, no, you're right, yeah. Hey, snakes, Malvani. Yo. The mess up. Ah. Such a basic thing. Hi, President. How are you? I'm good. Nice to meet you.
Here's your microphone.
Oh,
Thank you, sir.
it's easier.
Can I just
Okay.
have your forehead?
Oh, yeah, it's
Just
shining, huh?
Thank you.
What is that? What is that?
What's that?
That's-
The powder. Is it
So
okay?
you must tell me these things before, Mrs. Step. Yeah, you can't just put anything on the president's face. Please.
She asked him respectfully.
Yeah, I know.
She didn't just.
I know, but there's a...
Yeah,
there's
yes.
a process. Thank you.
Let's go.
Yes, please.
But Cynthia, get the cover so that the sun goes.
No, I just do
Yeah,
here. I'm not gonna do the whole.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I'll speak to him.
Sorry about that.
Are you going to take it off? Problem if you do that, you don't take it off.
How are you, President?
I'm good. I have terrible cold. I came from Japan with terrible cold.
Is it?
So my voice is affected
When
here.
did you come back?
Just President,
Just
we're all
now?
together as
Okay,
President
yes,
Cyril.
of course.
We're
Yes,
together
of
in
course.
Japan.
Yeah. It's been very very busy.
Yeah.
So anyway, the way you're holding the mic is perfect.
It's perfect.
Yes.
Oh.
You must pretend
I was
you're
at it.
singing a love song or
I
something.
used to do that.
You did?
Yeah, I used to be very good at that.
Oh, really?
When I was young.
Good afternoon. You are coming to us live here at the World Economic Forum, and of course we are getting reaction to the passing of... Okay. Like, seriously? Okay. Okay, Lucia, you're going to cue me, obviously. Thank you. Good morning here at the World Economic Forum, where we have the world at our feet because of a global gathering, basically looking at African development. And of course, sadly, we learned today of the passing of Robert Mugabe, the former President of Zimbabwe. And of course, we are taking reactions coming through from some of the significant people who are here at the WEF meeting. And of course, I'm joined in studio here by Hage Geingob. He's the President of Namibia, just to get his thoughts and feelings on the passing of Robert Mugabe. Thanks very much, sir, for joining us. Can we get your reaction?
Well, Zimbabweans have lost their founding father, revolutionary, who fought to free his country. Namibians also lost a very good comrade. He has been working with us. I particularly was sent there before I went back to Namibia for elections as a director of elections to learn from their experience. And Mnangagwa was the one who was assigned to be with us. Africa also lost a very ardent Pan-Africanist, and also the world, also statesmen. The way the world is amassed, the CNN, all of them are on the case. That means he's a true statesman, but they are always controversial too.
Yes.
So
he certainly left his mark. What would you say is his legacy?
His legacy is to defend what is yours. African must know the land belongs to them, and we must fight for it. That was his situation, that he was definitely trying to hold on to what he believes in. And therefore, there were some, of course, repercussions from there, some problems from there. But land question, he told us, British, you keep your Britain, I keep my Zimbabwe. But now you have to be flexible. He also told us that Namibian situation is different, South African situation is different. So we have to approach it differently, of course.
Yes.
We don't know what forced him to take the action he took. Somehow I know what happened, but Namibia is different. We are approaching it differently.
Yes, of course.
But we lost a great statesman.
And of course, we know that this gathering has been happening focusing on Africa and its development, particularly with the fourth industrialization at the top of the agenda. What do you take away from this? And for Namibians, ordinary Namibians watching at home, how are you hoping that they can benefit from these meetings here?
The mistake is always made that when we go to meetings, we are going to go back with goodies for our people in the street. That's not how it works. Investment is deferred gratification. From this kind of a gathering, we are going to connect, and one day there will be investment. They're not going to know where it comes from. They're not going to know it's coming from this kind of a gathering. So the deferred gratification. But connecting our people, business people, connecting with world players, it's very important. World is becoming a small village.
Yes.
We are talking about fourth industrial revolution, robotics and these kind of things. We are talking about people to retool. We're not going to do the things the way we've been doing it all these years.
Yes.
Otherwise, we'll be left behind again.
That's right.
We cannot blame anybody.
Indeed. Your Excellency, thank you very much for your
Very good.
time. That was Your Excellency, the President of Namibia, Hage Geingob, and I pass you back to studio.
When South African who pronounce my name very well.
Okay, thank you. I tried my best. Bless you.
types of ideas and get them to fruition, there could be a good potential. So the theme is for business investors, foreign and here, is how can we use the 4IR technologies to leapfrog, whether it's in fintech, food tech, safe and smart cities, for example, and eliminate some of the bottlenecks. There's the digital trade bottlenecks. If you want to be an intra-regional power, you need to go from the 19th century to the 21st century in terms of how we handle cross-border trade and customs. We talked in the session about data. If you want to create, collect, and protect your data from outsiders, from people that have bad purposes, and use them for your own purposes, you need a better regulatory framework. That will help investment, make it easier for people to invest in the businesses of the future. So overall, my main question is one of hope, but also a call to action, because the real issue with 4IR technologies is, will you use it in Africa to control your own destiny? Because if you don't, it's a global business. Everyone's looking at Africa as an opportunity to exploit. Africa for Africans should be the opportunity to exploit, inside out versus outside in.
Thank you. I think it was very good. An optimistic one. That was the international CEO's outlook for Africa. Sipho M. Putiana, Chairman Anglo Gold, do you share this outlook of Africa being like a large startup? What is your take on the opportunities and the challenges you see for business in Africa in the coming decade?
Well, thank you very much. I think that we've had a very interesting conversations, clearly, where the threats and concerns about the impact, possibly negative impact of 4IR on the African continent are a thing that we talk about more often than not. The good opportunities are there, and I think the conversations reflected a great deal on those. There is a digital divide. Africa is lagging behind in many respects, and so we need to move with speed. The sense one gets is that the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is a catalyst. After all, the African continent, I know that we believe individually that our countries are big and can do these things in their own right. The moment is one where we need to have an African leadership that is Pan-Africanist, that speaks and thinks in a Pan-Africanist way, and more importantly, acts Pan-Africanist, in that these opportunities require collective platforms, so we need to soften our borders to enable easy movement of high-end skills, given the fact that we don't have skills in abundance, and to be able to adapt.
Okay, is it pre-recorded? Yeah, we're going to do a pre-record. Okay, no problem. Where's Elsie? I haven't seen. Yeah, you just.
She'll be in the closing plenary now.
Oh yeah.
So, and after that, yeah, she's there till 1:30.
Okay.
We've got a performance. I think we've got a saxophonist.
I saw. Oh, nice.
At 1 o'clock.
Oh.
A local guy.
To have an impact in different areas. We need to think.
We're close to wrapping up the World Economic Forum on Africa, where the theme has been shaping inclusive growth and shared futures in the fourth industrial revolution. And just to give us a recap of what's taken place here over the last number of days, I'm joined in our studio by Oliver Can. He's the head of communications at WEF. Thanks very much for joining us, sir.
Thank you.
Good stuff. So, of course, there's been a lot of headline news around the World Economic Forum, but a lot going on in the actual meetings as well. Just give us a sense of how well things have gone.
Sure. So we all know what the World Economic Forum is about. We're about those long-term knotty challenges that we face as a region, as countries, as governments, as businesses, how to fix the challenges that really need badly addressing: unemployment, skills, climate change, internet penetration, all those development issues that are so crucial. But at the same time, we also have to look close to home and take on the short-term challenges too. So, as you know, this week there have been two very strong stories around gender-based violence, which has been absolutely terrible development, a real crisis in this country, across Africa, and also, I may say, across large parts of the world as well. And of course, xenophobia. So a lot of the energy, and rightly so, at this meeting has been focused on how to address that, how we've got the leaders from all over Africa and all over the world, business leaders that want to invest in Africa, have a vested interest in seeing these challenges and these problems fixed.
Yes.
I'm very proud to be able to say that after a session that we convened yesterday, there will be an action plan backed by the South African government to bring tech solutions that will ideally help empower women and provide assistance for women in need. That's going to be announced in the closing plenary in a few minutes' time.
Yes.
We also have a number of initiatives backed by business to improve and foster better integration, and that means with Nigeria and South Africa, and keep dialogue open. Our big strong message there is that we need dialogue. We work all around the world, and we are used to working in areas where diplomatic tensions can be quite high, and we have found over the years, we will be 50 years old in January, we have found that the only way to overcome differences is to talk.
You know, one of the things that a few of my friends and colleagues have been asking is why is this emphasis on the fourth industrial revolution for the continent when we haven't in many instances been able to keep up with the third industrial revolution, particularly around our infrastructural development and so on, and we're looking to become this massive trade hub, the African continental free trade area. So how is technology going to help us in terms of that? Because you still need trucks to carry goods from one place to another in order to service a market.
But one day, and we're already seeing this, one day those trucks may not be driven by human beings, and this is one of the challenges. So it's a completely valid discussion whether we need to focus on the fourth industrial revolution. What we're saying is we're neither for it or against it, but we know it's coming, and we're quite concerned about some of its implications, and we're quite excited about some of its prospects, so that we know. Unlike Asia or the Asian tigers, whose development was driven by low-cost manufacturing and has enabled them to move up the value chain, we don't think this is going to be happening as much for Africa. Africa needs to find its own way forward. And as a result of this, then why not use the fourth industrial revolution to help the first, second and third? We have a program in Oman in the Middle East where date farmers, for example, are using drones to carry out surveys and assessments of their plantations. Now that is great because it helps provide the workers with greater skills, helps them earn more money, and helps drive productivity. Yes. We're saying you talk about infrastructure. It's a very, very good point. And I don't know the statistic, but a large proportion of the African population lives beyond 2 miles from a paved road, for example. So why not use drones? Yes. And drone services, of course, is one area where Africa is a leader. It's not even leapfrogging. It's setting the pace in the world for commercial and civilian use of drones. So those are just a few of the examples. But we believe technology is vital. We see e-commerce as having the possibility of creating 3 million jobs. Financial technology, remittances, the new solutions that can help people pay and have access to finance, a huge growth area which could add huge amounts to the African economy in the next few years.
The World Economic Forum serves as a really positive force because it's looking to unite the world and get people to work collaboratively and so on. But then, of course, right now in the world, things are changing. People are becoming more polarized. People are becoming more nationalistic. So how do you work against that tide?
Well, look, it's a very difficult time for the world. If we look at it, you're absolutely right. We're not in a world dominated by a hegemonic power like the United States. We're fast moving towards a multipolar world, as we call it, different centers of power. And what we're seeing is greater regionalization, whether it's between Asia or the Americas or Europe. That's not healthy. And we know that trade, international trade, has been a great way of improving livelihoods and standards of living. but it has also led to inequality, and that's something that needs to be addressed. Nevertheless, we believe openness is the way forward. This is one reason why there are so many businesses here that are optimistic about Africa, because Africa is actually bucking that trend. It signed the Continental Free Trade Agreement this year.
Yes.
Minister Mbeweni said, and I totally agree with him, he said in the opening plenary yesterday that he believed this was the biggest thing to happen to Africa since the end of the colonial era. I believe it also, but it's a unique window, and if it isn't capitalized upon, and if integration isn't allowed to happen and cooperation isn't allowed to be fostered across this region, then it is a missed opportunity.
Yes, absolutely. Well, the work has to just begin. Thank you so much, Oliver, for
Thank
your
you.
time. As always, Oliver Kahn, he's the head of communications of the World Economic Forum, and that's where we're going to leave it. Back to studio.
Continent all has to do with replicating what has been done somewhere else is wrong. Culturally, there is something much more powerful here, and that nature has an opportunity to give you something that we have not anymore, that we have lost. And I think it is extraordinarily important to understand that nature is not something that stops you to develop, but that it is an opportunity for development. In fact, I've been hearing in different meetings, it's $1 trillion opportunity for investment. If you look at infrastructure, as long as infrastructure is green and treats nature with respect, you will be able to achieve better results than what you achieve in other places by treating it as an aid to development and not as an impediment to development. Now, that might sound a little bit airy-fairy, and I know that a number of people are absolutely convinced that the only way to be efficient is to ignore nature and to destroy it so that you can grow. There is a growth model which can be participative, and there is leadership that Africa can show to the rest of the world. I urge the participants to this forum to think about how they could make their business more nature-friendly, and not just because nature is beautiful, but because nature is the thing that supports our life on Earth. David Attenborough at the last meeting of the World Economic Forum in Davos talked about maintaining the life system support on Earth. And that is very, very real feeling. So we will bring the theme again to Davos in 6 months' time. But in the meantime, I have this vision of a strong, culturally driven Africa who could help us to give nature the position it truly deserves.
Thank you, and I think this is a nice bridge over to you, Alan Agler, Chief Executive Officer of the End Fund. This collaboration between philanthropic organizations and civil society and possibly also business can make a huge difference also to meet the Sustainable Development Goals and all this. So reflections from your side after 3 days here?
Well, first of all, this has been an amazing 3 days, and it has been a personal honor to serve for the first time as a co-chair. And I'm thinking about, cooks coming together in a kitchen, as Arantxa said. We all came together a few days ago, and most of us, didn't know each other. And I find that over the course of 3 days, I have done and feel like observed what WEF does best, which is weave together a community in a deeper way. And I find myself passionate about disease elimination, and I've seen amazing discussions about how philanthropy and civil society can work together in a different way. But I've also been telling people about Anglo Gold social impact, and I've also been pitching the South African government about what Welcome is doing on mental health. I feel like I've never knew so much about e-commerce and how to advocate for that as an issue, and the opportunity of the Africa Growth Platform. I mean, all of us have gone deeper with issues that we're challenging with, and I see that across this whole community. And to me, it's a reminder of we can all do more. We can all actually have an influence outside of our own sector. We need platforms like this to integrate and communicate and to get really tangible about what does that look like and what are the next steps and what's actionable. I can't help but see Elsie here in the front row and thank her so much for her vision with this. I remember 4 years ago we were here in Cape Town, and Elsie stood on this stage and talked about what I feel as well. There are so many challenges to getting this work done. It's hard for all of us personally, the sacrifices that we make, but also the opportunities that we have. And she laid out all of these challenges, and she said to everyone, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to do it anyway. And I think that was something that I took home and I continue to remember from 4 years ago. Like, what are those things that feel hard right now, but we know are needed, that they're shouting about in the streets, that we feel in our own heart? And I just feel that same call after this meeting. Like, we can all do more, and we can do more not only for pushing new models of how we work together, but across all these sectors. So it's just a huge honor.
Thank you so much. The honor was ours. Jeremy Farrer, Director, Wellcome Trust. Your contribution to this continent is vast, and I know the work you've done in the area of vaccines, but you are also involved in so many projects. So it was great to have you here as a co-chair, and I guess you have reflected on what other co-chairs have said, and also your vision for moving forward in Africa.
Yeah, thanks very much. And just one piece of advice to future co-chairs: always try and not end up as the last commentary on the table, because otherwise you're left with very little to say and only in agreement with what others have said. One of the joys of being here for the last 3 days, though, has been to be able to try and forget for a little bit the horrors of Brexit. And Brexit has hardly come up as a conversation. But I think there are potentially important things to learn from Brexit, and I'm not going to comment on countries across the Atlantic. I'll stick to the country I come from. And that is, as we've heard from my other co-chairs, we are at a time of remarkable progress in so many ways. But there is no doubt that we also face some huge challenges: climate change, the coming of drug resistance, epidemics in the health arena, the non-communicable diseases. But perhaps the biggest one of all, even in my view bigger than climate change, is inequality. And if we go through the fourth industrial revolution, which WEF has been so brilliant at pushing forward, and we don't learn some of the lessons from the first three, and how we did leave parts of society behind or outside the progress that can be made, it doesn't matter what the elites that everybody in this room is part of design or think about. But if we don't bring society and the community with us as part of the development of that future, then I'm afraid it will end up in similar tensions that the first, the second, and the third industrial revolutions had. And from my background as a doctor, as a scientist, the ability to address some of our great challenges through science and innovation in the public and the private sector is almost unprecedented in human history. But we have to act, we have to see the urgency, and we have to ensure that we don't leave society outside the room, but is part of it, because without them, we won't be able to achieve the progress that's possible.
Thank you. I think your intervention showed that there were still a lot to cover. You'll have a chance to come back. I would like to go back to Sipho Pitiana, the chairman of Anglo. Two things I would like you to comment on. One is on the question that Jeremy just mentioned about inequalities, how to create necessary economic growth, that is a prerequisite when you have all these young people, but also making sure that that growth is more inclusive. How is that, how to combine those two things? As one question. The other one is this Pan-Africanist vision and action and approach that you're asking for. You see leaders in Africa today that are committed to this, because it's really about leadership. So those two questions, and you have 1.5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. I think that the very step of the agreement of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is an indication of an appreciation of the fact that we have to adopt a Pan-Africanist approach. But the rhetoric tends to be nationalistic as well. I want the following things for my country, I want the following things for my country. And the problem, of course, is that more often than not, there isn't sufficient scale, and that's keeping us backwards. So all I'm saying is that let's build on the underlying sentiment of strong Pan-Africanism. You know, shouldn't we be talking about buying African? Shouldn't we be talking about protection of investments, promotion and protection of investments of Africans in different African economies, so that the scourge of what we saw in xenophobic attacks of small businesses in Johannesburg and in KwaZulu-Natal should be frowned upon not only by people in this room, but by the African continent in its entirety. Because to the extent that we don't have that embraced by the entirety of societies where we are, it's a drawback. So that's the point that I'm making in respect of that. So it's very, very important. The idea that business comes into, and I'm talking about big business now, particularly multinational companies, that you go into various jurisdictions on the African continent to make a quick buck and dash off, is an outdated model of business engagement. Business has to define itself as a partner with the African countries in the pursuit of the Agenda 2063, which is an agenda of the African continent, in ensuring that sustainable development goals are realized, in raising issues that could make it more possible for the African countries to achieve potential that all of us talk to. And that the nature and the relation and the structuring of the relationships between business, particularly business and governments, is a sustainable one. We've had and participated in conversations around the role of business in post-conflict sustaining of peace, and business must have a role there. Where do demobilized combatants land up? They must be afforded job opportunities, they must be trained, they must be enabled to be entrepreneurs. Businesses must not be corrupt and fund illicit activities that end up propping up wars. So all of these things suggest that to the extent that business is outside of this conversation, it will be a force for the destruction of the continent when we can turn it into a positive force for the development of the continent.
Thank you. Andrea Hoffman, you were nodding very actively when it was mentioned that business as a partner. Business has to be a partner also with African development. And we have two schools here. We have the school that business has also a broader responsibility, as also the World Economic Forum was founded on, and another school saying the business of business is business. So for Roche and your company, where you were vice chairman, I guess you have also a clear vision for taking broad responsibilities.
So the statement that made me nod vigorously is the one who's saying you don't make a quick buck and you run away. You know, you really need to build this partnership. And to come back to this notion of long-term thinking is absolutely essential for corporations. The aim of corporation is not just to make money, the aim of corporation is to serve a community. And I can see that in Africa, this would be a particularly relevant thing. If you want to create a prosperity which is going to solve some of the issues we've been discussing here, i.e. health and hunger, you will need to make sure that there is a long-term thinking into the way business is conducted. And that's, I'm afraid to say, hasn't been the case in the past. And that's one of the reasons why I would like to sort of propose this model of a nature-based economy, because nature is something that is going to be staying as long as we need it. Nature-enhancing economy is what I would really see as a model. In agriculture in particular, you know, we can, with the help of new technologies, increase the amount of efficacy of farming and the better use of water and better use of resources allocation in the whole farming construction. We've spent a lot of time saying, nature should be able to pay its keep. If we keep it, it's because it actually pays for itself. And the way to do this normally is to talk about tourism and of any definitions. But tourism, although it's an important contributor, will never be sufficient. We need to find other ways of doing it. If we want to address the whole hunger issue, we will have to continue to do agricultural practices which are more and more efficient. The fourth industrial revolution has a way to deal with that, and I hope that there will be a number of investments of that nature being done around us. The simple message is this one. Business can also be a long-term partner. Business is not only there for exploiting, taking what is here and run away. Business is here for the long term, and in particular SMEs. So I very much welcome your remarks. And again, I had this discussion with a number of you, and I know that it is a feeling that is growing. People really believe in it, and I'm so glad to hear that.
Thank you, Andrea. It's tempting then to turn to you, Alex. Some people talk about like hard-nosed American CEOs, but we saw also that the US Business Roundtable came out on this topic. Andrea was just saying, no, it needs to be, business needs to be a long-term partner and not run away. But then you also have those that say that, it's too complicated. Business of business is business. You have to make money and then you will tax them. Reflections from you?
Well, certainly. I mean, I can't speak for all types of businesses and the like, and it's great to be a private company versus a public company. I personally believe, and my firm believes, that the definition of success has to be more than financial. We have an obligation as trustees and stewards of this world and the communities we serve to have a lasting positive impact on the people that we employ, the people that we could employ and influence and inspire, as well as the communities that we mutually should benefit from. So fully behind that approach. I mean, to Sifo's point, and I think the small and medium businesses in particular are the future and the heartbeat of any economy, but particularly African economies, because you have less of a reliance on sort of global export, MNCs, et cetera, as, for example, Asia did, or even Latin America. So you got to make that work. And I agree also with the analogy, Arancha, about, it is a meal that needs multiple chefs, but they can get in the way of each other. You need to find a way to be inclusive and less adversarial, take away some of the stereotypes. Not all businesses act the same way. Not all communities and governments act in the same way. And I think there is a win-win here if we actually can share perspectives. So if I was a business person talking to the governments and the regulators of Africa, what I would say is, listen, you got to start with reality. We've got a lot of different countries at different starting points because Africa is 54 countries. But you also have 54 different legislative frameworks on data.
Yep.
Okay, only 23 of those 54 countries actually have a legislation framework, and I'm sure it's not harmonized. 7 of them are in draft mode. The others have either no data or no legislation. I'm not saying that everyone needs to have it, but if you want to have a free trade environment and the future and the vision in 2063 or even 2023, there needs to be a little bit more movement and more cooperation and acknowledgement that everyone needs to contribute to the success of this great continent.
I think, Jeremy, you wanted to comment? Okay, then on Arancha, on this more standards that are shared, 54 different standards. It's not really internal market.
Yeah, and this is exactly very clearly illustrated in the discussions on electronic commerce, which at the end of the day has a lot to do with, for example, data protection. If every country treats the issue of data protection on a purely national basis, it's going to fragment, not create a level playing field. So what we need is solutions that will help us build a level playing field below the national, understanding that maybe the systems would be slightly different, but they will be interoperable. There will be ways to move with passerelles from one system to another to benefit from this larger market. There is one issue, though, that I wanted to come back to, having listened to SIPO, which is, at the end of the day, all these trade agreements need to be made to work for the 99% of businesses in this continent, which are small and medium companies. And in these small and medium companies, there is a big category called women-owned businesses that today are not exactly in a very good position to benefit from this agreement. We've heard all the issues around gender-based violence, and I suffice it to say that on this one, I think we have to put an end to that. But there are many other areas where the position of women is also not equal to that of men. And this is also in the economy. So supporting women entrepreneurs, also take advantage from the Continental Free Trade Agreement, will be important for the solidity, not just for the justice, but for the solidity of the efforts of integrating trade in the continent.
Thank you. Jeremy, you were mentioning how science could also contribute to development, and your partnership, for example, in also developing vaccines to fight pandemics has been so important, and we've seen that now lately also with the Ebola outbreak in DRC. I think you have a strong message there. So could you share some of what you have done, but also your aspirations in the coming year?
Yeah, and to pay tribute to the role that you played in a previous life from Norway, and pay tribute to what Norway's done for global health, which is...
I wasn't fishing for that, no, but thank you.
Staggering. And a particular individual called Tore Godal, who deserves enormous credit from all of us. I heard the Prime Minister of Norway recently describe him as the most expensive Norwegian ever, but he's changed the world in terms of the vaccines that came along. Yeah, what we together set up, along with others, the Gates Foundation, Japan, Germany, and other governments around the world, was to try and ensure that money, capital, and pricing did not stop the development of innovative science when there was not going to be a market. Epidemics come and go. You cannot rely on the sales of those vaccines. There's no market incentives. We're facing the same problem with the rise of drug resistance, and what we created together called CEPI was an attempt to try and bring public-private partnerships to bear to make vaccines for epidemic diseases, and has been extraordinarily successful with the vaccines in DRC at the moment. But I met this morning with what we were hearing from Alex and others, a medium-sized vaccine manufacturing company here in Cape Town. University of Cape Town is an extraordinarily strong academic institution, one of the best universities in the world, certainly also in the continent, and a spin-out from there. 200 or 300 people now. They're going to be too small to move through the regulatory pathway of every country on the continent, and yet Africa desperately needs vaccine manufacturing capacity on the continent for Africa, run by Africans, providing vaccines for Africans and making a profit in order to do so. And here was a company that struggled with short-term grants and small amounts of money in order to move forward, and won't be able to compete with larger organizations when it comes to getting regulatory approval in every country. So regulatory and trade is not just about the movement of e-commerce and the fourth industrial, it's about some of the things that we need today. And a regulatory environment across the continent that brought together the drug regulatory agencies would have a dramatic impact on the ability to transform some truly great science through organizations like the African Academy of Sciences into things that people need to make health better.
Wow. Arantxa, can't we just fix this?
I mean, what I would tell you is exactly the same answer that we have on data protection, on food standards, on medicine standards, on standards for mobile phones, on standards for cars, is if you take a purely national approach, it's not going to work. You need a collaborative effort. And this is why multilateralism matters. And this is why it matters that we nurture the multilateral organizations that give us this global level playing field.
Wow. Of course, the World Economic Forum is impartial and neutral, but that was a very timely comment. I'm thinking of you, Ellen. This is also something that is very close to your heart, health, vaccination, mobilizing, also the public. So.
Well, I'm really struck by first the comment on, is it business for the sake of shareholders or is it business for social good? And I just would say that's a false dichotomy. And, we've seen over and over working with the pharmaceutical sector, it's amazing how many times I engage with the pharma sector and they say we keep the best people because of our programs on engaging in neglected diseases. That's one of the things that actually helps with retention, helps with talent acquisition. I think that from the mining sector, it was very clear that when they saw the impact on labor productivity, if they didn't deal with malaria amongst their workers, they weren't going to be able to have as much profits. Yeah. And I think Jeremy gave such an excellent example. I mean, the efforts around trying to manufacture drugs, manufacture vaccines, having more proximity of production of supplies. I mean, a huge amount of the health economy is goods and supplies. And if more can be created on this continent, I think it's an opportunity not for better health outcomes, but also for growth. I think we've looked at, in general, the health economy is about 10% or more of GDP globally, and in Africa it's only 6%, and that gap represents a huge opportunity for growth. Yep. And for jobs that are more gender friendly, in the sense that usually 2/3 of women are employed in the health sector, whereas it's more like 40% in other sectors. So I just think, Ranjit, she has an amazing way of putting words, but we were at dinner the other night and she was talking about how, one way to look at Pan-Africanism also is through the disease elimination, because mosquitoes don't have passports. We have to work cross-border. We have to work in on a regional perspective, especially when vectors are traveling and changing, and the impact of climate change on disease is also shifting dynamics so much. So huge opportunities, I think, and that looking at Pan-Africanism through that lens of public health. I know that the African CDC was featured here this week, and I think that having more institutions that really are looking at things from a systems lens and a continental lens is quite exciting. And I know that from my perspective, there are so many philanthropists and so many actors in civil society who want to plug into that from a real systems change level.
Wow. You're really good at those sound bites, I have to say. Arantxa. Mosquitoes don't have passports. I think also CO2 emissions doesn't have passports. Absolutely. Maybe we should share that information more broadly.
Data doesn't have passports either.
Since we're in Africa and South Africa, maybe let's have Sipho have the last word here on this, what I think has been an excellent panel. We have brilliant co-chairs this year. Thank you, Elsie, for making such a great selection. But there is so much at stake here in Africa. So we need really Pan-African leadership and action. And Sipho, you're not only an experienced businessman, but you also spend a lot of your career in government. So last minute, are you optimistic on behalf of Africa? Do you think you will overcome all the challenges moving forward? Is this Africa the new Asia, and is this Africa's century?
Well, I think that the prospects for the African continent are bright, and we know what needs to be done. We need leadership that is capable and has the determination to act and act collaboratively. It is estimated, by the way, that in 2020, 39% of core skills for various occupations on the African continent will have changed. What does that mean in terms of how we share infrastructure across the continent? to enable the digital generation, that young people with the youth bulge that we have here, which is an advantage for the African continent, to connect and enable and access those skills and be pioneers, innovators, and a new generation that is capable of driving the change that we're talking about. It means that we should improve access to educational infrastructure across the continent. The idea that you must sit with the planning department of a particular ministry in your government and all of that and plan building schools and training centers and universities, that layout of that infrastructure is going to take a long time. So we need to think differently about how we use technology for e-learning, online learning, access world-class institutions on the continent, in the world, top-class training facilities and institutions, if we're going to indeed move with speed to access and enable young people who are yearning for these opportunities that they can see in front of them, take advantage of those. That's the kind of approach that we need to adopt. That's the kind of approach that we need to pursue.
Thank you. Again, I would like to thank our distinguished co-chairs. When we finish with this panel, we're not done, because we also have a couple of other very nice things that are going to happen. We're going to have some more contributions, and we're also going to end with some music. So please be seated. We're going to rearrange a little bit, but we are fast in doing that. But again, on behalf of the World Economic Forum, on behalf of Professor Schwab and myself, thank you so much for being our co-chairs and also contributing so much on the substance. And I think we even had a little bit fun at the end, even if we're dealing with very serious issues. So thank you.
Yeah.